sure everyone can join the Zoom, and if you can make sure you are muted, that would be great. And we'll begin now. Thank you for joining today's Zoom. I'm pleased to welcome you to Mishkon Tefilo's adult education program on the Polish Jewish artist Arthur Szyk. It's pronounced Szyk, even though it's spelled S-Z-Y-K. I'm Shelley Berger, the coordinator of today's program and a member of the Mishkon Tefilo Adult Education Committee. Zola Berger-Schmitz, I'm going to wave Zola, will be assisting me today with technical logistics, as well as Mishkon staff member Manny Shaw. Thank you, Zola and Manny. Our speaker this morning is Irvin Ungar, a former pulpit rabbi, an antiquarian bookseller, an expert on Arthur Szyk, the co-producer of a Szyk documentary, and the author of numerous books on Szyk. Irvin Ungar has curated Szyk Museum exhibits around the world, and his memoir on Szyk, titled Reviving the Artist Who Fought Hitler, is forthcoming in 2026. I first met Irvin Ungar through Stand With Us, which will be presenting a program at Mishkon in April for Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Memorial Day. Stay posted for that and other upcoming programs. We have a terrific series of Mishkon Tefilo events this spring, both online and in person in Venice, California, including online next week as Friends of Ahavat Torah, their talk with journalist Thomas Elias. Before we begin, a word about the famous Szyk Hagaddah. Some of you on today's Zoom have shared with me that you own a Szyk Hagaddah from back in the day. One of you mentioned it was inherited from someone's father. Even our own wonderful Mishkan rabbi, Rabbi Joshua Katzan, recalls repeatedly being exposed to the Szyk Hagaddah while growing up. The Hagaddah was illustrated in Poland in the 1930s before Arthur Szyk fled to the United States. Originally published, I believe, in 1940, but we're going to hear a lot more about that. And beginning in the 1950s, reproduced in much larger numbers. Most recently, published again in 2008, an edition that was edited by today's speaker, Irvin Ungar. I became so intrigued with this Szyk Hagaddah, planning this event, that I bought some copies of the 2008 edition online, and we plan to refer to it at this year's Family Seder. Some of you may want to purchase it online as well. The plan for today was to hear something about the Szyk Hagaddah, but also to hear a great deal about Szyk's life, his political activism, which I think is very relevant today, and a wide range of his artwork, including Nazi resistance caricatures that were widely distributed across the United States during World War II. And as I understand it, Szyk also did a lot of secular art for children's literature, Shakespeare, many other things. We have a slight change of plans. Mr. Ungar was ill earlier this week, along with 4 members of Mishkon staff, but we don't live in the same city. He's on the mend, but has a scratchy voice. Luckily, it's not entirely lost, but as of a few hours ago, he wasn't sure he could talk through his entire presentation, at least what we'd planned. So we're improvising. He will still be answering your questions live after today's presentation. But first, he's going to share with us instead a slide talk he gave last year at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, and then he will answer your questions. The talk is more of a deep dive into just the Hagaddah, far more technical than what we had originally planned. It was one of a series of 4 talks he gave at the Museum of Jewish Heritage last year. But if you're willing to bear with us and stay the course, I think you'll learn some fascinating history. Thanks for your patience and flexibility on the slight change of plans. After today's talk, our speaker will answer questions, as I mentioned. The chat feature should be on during the entire program. So please type your questions in the chat thread, which you can do during the talk or immediately after. Zola Berger-Schmitz, who is assisting today, will be checking the chat and will share as many of your questions as possible with the speaker. If there's time after that, we can open it up to questions or concise comments out loud. And if you're called on at that point, you can unmute yourself and ask your question or make your hopefully brief comment. For those who are interested, we can stay just a few minutes after 12 noon, but we will end the Zoom sometime between 12:10 and 12:15 p.m. Okay, thank you, Irvin, for your quick improvising, and let's get started.
Yeah, thank you, Shelley, for having me. And yesterday I started losing my voice. Today you could maybe hear something in it. I will mute myself during my presentation, and perhaps we can answer questions about Szyk's overall life and any details you want when the program's over. But I do hope you'll enjoy this and on with the program.
A vignette before you of European Jews clustered in chains, together with the pyramids of ancient Egypt, provides a window into the artist's moving of history and transporting of time and place. This image demonstrates how Szyk uses a traditional text, in this case, the ancient Hagaddah narrative, to provide a visual commentary on contemporary events which he partially witnessed and fully envisioned in 1930s Poland and Europe on the eve of the Holocaust. This presentation will focus on the specific themes emphasized by Szyk within the context of his Hagaddah, drawing particular attention to his activist nature and his call for a response by his Jewish brothers and sisters to the tragedy unfolding before them in Nazi-occupied Europe, and to an unprepared world virtually silent to their plight. The Hagaddah tells the story of the Exodus from Egypt. Who brought the Israelites out? Not Moses. How they were brought out? Not by Moses. And why they were brought out. The Exodus is the seminal event in Jewish history and remembered in daily ritual prayers and every Friday evening when Jews chant the Kiddush, the prayer over the wine, and recite the Hebrew words Zecher Litziat Mitzrayim as a reminder of the Exodus from Egypt. And why do Jews need to routinely remind themselves of freedom? Why do all of us, Jew and non-Jew, need to be summoned? Because that right is not given. It must be constantly protected and safeguarded. One must be vigilant in its defense. And this is Arthur Szyk. Passover is that great story of freedom from degradation and shame, from bondage and oppression, and it is the obligation of every Jew to tell that story to the next generation. And that story can be told with either a Maxwell House Hagaddah or the Szyk Hagaddah, or the more than 5,000 editions in between. I would like to think that Arthur Szyk's Hagaddah, as will become apparent, rises to the very heights of capturing the essence of the Jewish past, the story of its then tragic present, and the need to rigorously be diligent to physically ensure a Jewish future. And given the present in which we find ourselves, the manner in which Szyk illuminates the Hagaddah narrative takes on particular significance for this coming Passover. Now, to the context of the creation of Szyk's Hagaddah. Please allow me to partially reference the setting, which I mentioned in my previous lecture, but is fully necessary here to understand Arthur Szyk's mindset at the time.
Do not worry.
In 1933, Hitler came to power, and the government of the United States invited Arthur Szyk to come to America for the purpose of exhibiting his artworks on freedom at the Library of Congress. And when he arrived with his wife Julia in December 1933, an exhibition of his art was already taking place at the Brooklyn Museum, in which two of his bodies of work were featured, namely Washington and His Times, 38 paintings which highlighted America's fight for freedom during the Revolutionary War, paintings which eventually hung in the White House at the time when Franklin Roosevelt delivered his famous For Freedom speech, and also exhibited at the museum was his Statutes of Kalisz, 45 paintings which advocated for the freedom of Jews in Poland beginning in the 13th century, as well as in the late 1920s and early 1930s in Poland and Europe. In 1934, in that exhibition, it then moved to the Library of Congress from the Brooklyn Museum. And in recognition of these exhibitions and Szyk's advocacy for freedom on behalf of humanity, he was presented with the George Washington Bicentennial Medal by the United States Congress. And this already after he had been decorated by the French government with the Palme Académique in 1923 and the Gold Cross of Merit by Poland in 1931, the highest award honoring Polish citizens. And these awards for his works, all in the service of mankind. With his third medal in hand, or should I say on his chest, after 7 months in the US, Szyk returned to Poland and his hometown of Lodz, and then began to illustrate the great book of freedom in Jewish tradition, the Hagaddah. Between 1934 and 1936, he illuminated 48 manuscript leaves, including the calligraphy, miniature watercolor and gouache paintings on paper. And for context, please keep in mind that Germany's racist Nuremberg laws of 1935 were instituted right in the middle of Szyk's working on the Hagaddah. In 1937, armed with the portfolio of his response to the Nazi threat to his people and the retelling and contemporizing of an ancient narrative, he carried those manuscript leaves with him to London, where over the next 3 years, he would supervise the printing of the Hagaddah. And while working on the Haggadah's publication process, Szyk would write in 1938 to his English translator, renowned Oxford scholar Cecil Roth, "The Hagaddah is the work of my life. I have sacrificed many years of my work, as well as all my fortune, which has been very small during the war, in order to do it. I have even contracted debts to complete it." In 1940, almost overshadowed by the falling bombs on London during the Battle of Britain, Szyk's Hagaddah was published on the finest of vellum skins in an edition of 250 copies in an elegant binding by the prestigious bookbinder Sangorsky and Sutcliffe. Cecil Roth declared, "To call Arthur Szyk the greatest illuminator since the 16th century is no flattery. It is the simple truth that manifests itself to anyone who studies his work with the care which it deserves." Similarly, the Times of London compared Szyk's Hagaddah to the masterpieces of the Middle Ages, stating, "It is worthy to be placed among the most beautiful of books that the hand of man has produced." And at $500 a copy, it was the most expensive new book in the entire world. The publisher was the Beaconsfield Press, a cooperative consisting of Jews from Lvov, who together with a few wealthy British Jews put up the money to publish only one book, the Hagaddah. They called it the Beaconsfield Press, hoping that they might capitalize on the name of the Earl of Beaconsfield, Benjamin Disraeli, a born Jew Queen Victoria's man of the people, who was twice Prime Minister of Great Britain. In 1956, 5 years after Szyk died, the first popular trade edition of his Hagaddah was published in Israel. 10,000 copies were printed in 1956. 10,000 copies were printed in 1957, continuing into the 1960s, the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and through the year 2000. In 2008, I published a new edition of the Szyk Hagaddah in Premier and Deluxe limited editions with a new translation and commentary by Rabbi Byron Sherwin, a prominent Chicago scholar affiliated with the Spertus Institute. I followed this by creating a popular trade edition in softcover, which Abrams Books published in 2011. With the history now of the creation of the Szyk Hagaddah now summarized, I would like to turn to the art itself and to start by explicating and decoding one Hagaddah page, which will help us understand how Szyk used his art to call world attention to the contemporary plight of his fellow Jews. This work is, in fact, the introductory dedication page for the Hagaddah itself. But first, a question. By a show of hands, which I cannot see, so raise your hands, how many of you can remember seeing the 2010 movie starring Colin Firth of the stutterer King George called The King's Speech? Okay, raise your hands, but I can't see. All right, it is this very king, George VI, to whom Szyk dedicated the Hagaddah, and who ascended the throne in December of 1936, at the time Szyk was completing all of the Hagaddah artwork. The illuminated text reads, "At the feet of your most gracious majesty, I humbly lay these works of my hands, shewing forth the afflictions of my people Israel." Arthur Szyk, Illuminator of Poland. Why did Szyk decide to dedicate the Great Book of Freedom to the newly proclaimed British monarch in 1936? He had two reasons. First, because Szyk planned to leave Poland at the end of that year for England to supervise the printing of the Hagaddah manuscript now as a book. And it made perfect literary sense to dedicate it to the new king. But second, and more importantly, for political reasons, Szyk saw Great Britain as the leading opponent of Nazism in Europe. Remember, America would not enter the war until 5 years later. By dedicating a book recalling the Jews' biblical liberation from tyranny to George VI, and then presenting the first copy of the Hagaddah to him, Szyk placed upon the king the responsibility to recognize the injustices done to the Jewish people in the past, and while awakening him to their present tragedy. But there is a problem with dedicating the Hagaddah to the British king. How so? After World War I, the League of Nations had granted Britain a mandate over the territories of the Ottoman Empire that included Palestine. By 1936, the British government had already enacted its first in a series of white papers, that is, documents designated to restrict the flow of European Jews to their ancestral homeland in Palestine. Knowing this, how could Szyk dedicate this book celebrating freedom to the head of a government that restricted the freedom of his people, that would keep them virtually trapped in Europe with no way to escape the grasp of the Nazi vulture to go safely to the land of Israel? How could he be both intellectually and emotionally honest in confronting this dilemma as an artist for freedom? And herein lies an example of the genius of Arthur Szyk. At the bottom right of this dedication page, he painted a modern exodus of European Jews in transit to the gates of Palestine, which are seen on the bottom left, inscribed in Hebrew with the word Zion, Zion. And between the Jews and the gate stands in the center a British military ship blocking their flight to freedom. The Hagaddah is a religious text, but for Arthur Szyk, it is also a political book about justice and freedom. His visual narrative speaks truth to power and presents a compelling call to action. And as if to emphasize who had overtly and boldly dared to put forth this call, Szyk painted his own portrait on the dedication page. We see him standing by his people, palette in hand, dressed in quasi-military garb as a soldier in art, fighting on their behalf, an illuminator of Poland. And this first copy was presented to the King of England. I shall now point out the themes which Szyk repeatedly emphasizes in his Hagaddah, after which I will then turn to the individual images which support those themes. First and foremost, it is clear that Szyk sees the Nazis as the new Egyptians who have come to annihilate his people. Secondly, he emphasizes that the response of his people must be heroism, not victimhood. Third, Szyk clearly calls attention to hatred and anti-Semitism of varying kinds directed against the Jewish people throughout history, and unequivocally and militantly advocates for the destruction of the eternal enemy of the people of Israel, namely the blotting out of the biblical Amalek and its evil descendants. Fourth, Szyk emphasizes the role of Moses and David in his Hagaddah. Fifth, Szyk places strong attention on Zionism motifs. Sixth, his portrayal of the four sons is entirely unique, not only within the Hagaddah, but within the whole of Jewish art. And his parable that derives from it following the war is equally powerful and poignant. And finally, attention will be paid to the 5 dedication pages which Szyk completed for the Hagaddah, only 2 of which were included in the 1940 publication. And now, to the multitude of images and the first of Szyk's themes, Hitler as the new Pharaoh and the Nazis as the new Egyptians. Szyk began attacking Hitler in his art as early as 1933 during his early commuting days between Poland and London. Here one sees Hitler as Pharaoh with his attendant Hermann Göring, who oversaw the creation of the Gestapo and was one of the most powerful figures in the Nazi Party, both dressed in Egyptian garb. This image did not appear in the Hagaddah, nor was it drawn for it. It was a sketch, never completed, but is proof of how Szyk saw the intent of the Nazi Führer as a ruler bent upon the destruction of the people of Israel, and how he associated him with the Passover narrative. This is 1933. Avadim Hayinu. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. And here we see an Egyptian taskmaster in the upper right with Aryan blonde hair and blue eyes, forcing Hebrew slaves, the people of one God, wearing yarmulkes, to chisel away and paint Egyptian gods, an ultimate act of humiliation. While in the vignette below, Pharaoh sits on his throne. I wish to call to your attention the circular yellow and round red rondel in the center of the chest of the Egyptian, again in the upper right. It was here and elsewhere in his Hagaddah that Szyk painted swastikas as a means of identifying the new taskmasters as Nazis. Those same rondels appear on armbands and chests of other Egyptians as well, on those seen below. But Szyk painted over them prior to publication. In the printed Hagaddah, as on the original artwork shown here, the swastikas are nowhere to be seen, likely as a result of the publisher's censorship and persuasion of Szyk to remove them, lest the Hagaddah might never see the light of day because of, shall I say, a form of political correctness of the day. I can only imagine how Szyk must have felt. But how do we know that the swastikas were there in the first place? In 2002, in preparation for the Szyk exhibition, The Art and Politics of Arthur Szyk, at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, I suggested to the museum to look for the swastikas on several of the Hagaddah pieces which were loaned. We Were Slaves, shown here, was one of those pieces. How did I know to tell them? Several years before, I met a man in his late 70s, Mr. Horowitz, in Tel Aviv, who told me that when he was a boy in Lvov, Szyk visited his father's home sometime in 1935 or 1936 to show the senior Horowitz, a sponsor of the Hagaddah's publication later in London, the Hagaddah art that Szyk had completed. Young Horowitz came down the steps late that night. Men were gathered around the dining room table examining Szyk's Hagaddah art, and squeezing between them, he told me, he saw swastikas on the Egyptians, on snakes, and on the arm of the wicked sun in the Hagaddah. All were eventually painted over or removed, as I indicated. But prior to the museum opening, through special magnification and with equipment able to see layers beneath layers of paint, the swastikas were indeed there. Mr. Horowitz was right. And so too, swastikas appeared initially on one of the most beautiful of Hagaddah images, the Four Questions. While the father or grandfather listens to the son or grandson read from the Hagaddah, within the large initial mem of the Hebrew word of Ma Nishtana, why is this night different from all other nights? And while we ourselves contemplate, why is this Passover different from all other Passovers? We see within the mem, smallish vignettes in the bottom of the mem, Egyptians drowning in the sea. In the upper left, a baby Moses. And lastly, in the upper right, the exodus of the Israelites. And above them, in their upper right corner, lurks the serpent, ready to attack the earliest freedom marchers. And on the snake's back are indeed swastikas, as can be seen on this lithograph printed in 1935. Remember, Szyk was working on the Hagaddah at that time, but then lithographs were printed. And on this lithograph, which I discovered in the Szyk archives, we see swastikas on the serpent before they were painted over on the original art prior to the 1940 publication. Indeed, Mr. Horowitz was right again. And here are Szyk's four sons, the wise, the wicked, the simple, and the one who does not know how to ask. Four adult men, four types of people. But for the rabbis and for Szyk, these were clearly for Jews. It is the wicked son in the upper left upon whom I wish to focus. In most all illustrated Haggadot prior to the 20th century, the wicked son was primarily portrayed as a soldier, an enemy of the Jewish people, his outward appearance and actions evidencing hatred. In Szyk's case, a wicked son is seen as a Jew clothed in the garb of self-hatred, a German Jew. As opposed to the Polish Jews, this German Jew with riding boots, a crop, a feathered hat, a cigarette, and a Hitler-like mustache. On this wicked son, Szyk once had painted a swastika, probably as an armband. But this is the image we have in the Hagaddah. And how do we know a swastika was once there? The clue here again comes from the original art itself, where we see the verso of the paper on which Szyk painted the four sons, paper left over for one of his earlier projects. And in the upper right-hand corner, that quadrant was cut out. The first wicked son was replaced with the one that we see now. And if we flip the sheet over, we can see that that quadrant, with remnants of old tape and the new tape, this new tape from 1934-35, would land in the upper left corner. Indeed, be the portion upon which the original wicked son was once painted. And Mr. Horowitz was right for the third time. The question remains, how could Szyk paint a swastika on a Jew and call a fellow Jew a Nazi, particularly at a time when Hitler was in power? The fact is that when Szyk painted this image in 1934, there were indeed Jews who supported the National Socialists and their economic policies, and to Arthur Szyk, they would have been as if they too were Nazis. Szyk's second theme now, emphasized in his Hagaddah, is response, heroism, not victimhood, symbolized by the numerous Jewish fighters and warriors. We see them in the dedication page to King George, a helmeted soldier with a 7-branched menorah atop. We see them in a warrior associated with the bread of affliction, which our ancestors ate in Egypt. They are present in the first battle with Amalek, a wilderness people with whom the Israelites fought after crossing through the Sea of Reeds, Israel's first enemy on its path to freedom. And in the great Hallel, a psalm of praise, we see Szyk's hero, a warrior. And in the context of the song, Echad mi Yadea, who knows one. And in the songs of Hagaddah and Dayedu, the young David is shown twice with the head of Goliath. And note that on the left, Goliath has blonde hair and blue eyes, Szyk portraying him as an Aryan to be dealt with. What does David have to do with the Hagaddah and the Passover narrative? Absolutely nothing. But for Arthur Szyk, everything, as he represents heroism and the need to stand up to the powerful enemy. It was images such as these with which Szyk hoped to inspire and uplift his people in mid to late 1930s Europe. And two last and unlikely presentation of heroic figures. First, the prophet Elijah. Here we see the beautiful cup of Elijah, but Szyk departs from emphasizing the ceremonial traditional visit by Elijah to every Jewish Passover Seder meal and his bringing of blessings, and instead chooses to call attention to Elijah's heroic act of confronting and rebuking the evil King Ahab on Mount Carmel. And here, The prophet Samuel puts Agag, the king of the Amalekites, to death before the Lord at Gilgal. We transition here from the heroes of ancient Israel, as Szyk sees them, to the eternal enemies of the Jewish people embodied by Amalek. To do so, it is essential first to highlight Szyk's illumination of the Hagaddah text, which we see here in the middle paragraph of the largest Hebrew letters. We see the text: in every generation, they stand against us to annihilate us. B'chol dor v'ador ondim aleinu l'chalotenu. Many of the various nations throughout history who attempted to annihilate the Jewish people are pictured within this single image by Szyk. The Assyrian king, represented by the mask in the lower left, the wheel of the Roman chariot in the bottom right, a Roman eagle standard, which is enlarged in the detail, bearing the famous Latin abbreviation SPQ or QAR, which is Senatus Populus Romanus, the Senate and the Roman people. The medieval shield, which is yellow and red, with the emblems of the Spanish kings of Castile and Leon, representing the Spanish Inquisition. The pinkish helmet, bearing the Hebrew word Haman, signifying the biblical story of Esther and Mordecai's triumph over Haman's plot to destroy the Jews during the holiday of Purim, commemorated just 2 weeks ago. The imperial double-headed eagle of Tsarist Russia, recalling the pogroms. You may have to look a little harder to see it, but it's there. And the cannons in the top right as symbols of a particular war or all wars. All while the Jew has survived these acts of genocide and can raise the cup in celebration of life, as we see at the top. This scene brings to my mind the words of Mark Twain, who in his short 1899 essay concerning the Jews for Harper's Magazine wrote, and I quote, "The Egyptian, the Babylonian, and the Persian rose. They filled the planet with sound and splendor, and then they faded to dream stuff and passed away. The Greek and the Roman followed and made a vast noise, and they are gone. Other peoples have sprung up and held their torch high for a time, but it burned out, and they sit in the twilight now or have vanished. The Jew saw them all, beat them all, and is now what he is always. Now he is as he always was, exhibiting no decadence, no infirmities of age, no weakening of his parts, no slowing of his energies, no dulling of his alert and aggressive mind. All things are mortal, but the Jew," Twain writes, "all other forces pass, but he remains. What is the secret of his immortality?" Perhaps, Mr. Twain, Mr. Szyk's response might be, it is in the Jew's stubborn attempt and insistence to adhere to a divine moral law and its intellectual challenge as represented by the Ten Commandments, which preside over this image, that offer a clue to their survival. And now to Amalek, the eternal enemy of the Jewish people. The teacher instructs his students, "You shall blot out the memory of Amalek from under the heaven. Do not forget." On the bottom of Elijah's cup, "You shall blot out the memory of Amalek." In the bottom center, the Lord will be at war with Amalek in every generation. And here, in Modern Moses, a work of art distributed by the Emergency Committee to Save the Jewish People of Europe, for which Szyk served as one of its vice presidents, Aaron, a man of peace, is replaced by a Jewish soldier, and Hur, the nephew warrior of Moses, is replaced by a resistance fighter to fight the modern Amalek of 1940s Europe. And now, Szyk's emphasis on the scales of justice. A leading nation is Amalek, but its fate is to perish forever. Amalek will be judged as evidenced by the scales of justice, as will King Belshazzar, who desecrated the vessels in the Holy Temple, according to the biblical book of Daniel, the Hebrew writing on the wall indicating that he will die. Scales of justice in Hagaddah. Judith meted out punishment to the invading Assyrian general Holofernes, killing him with his own sword, again justice as symbolized by the scales. And again, an enemy of ancient Israel is identified by Szyk with a swastika on the pommel of the sword. And now to David and Moses. For Szyk's Hagaddah, justice and retribution will ultimately prevail. He sees Jewish militancy and activism, of which David and Moses are paradigmatic models, as the primary vehicles for meting out justice to the foes of the people of Israel. First, Moses. 3 versions of Moses strikes the Egyptian appear here. In the far right image, appeared in the Hagaddah. The center image was painted in 1933, and the far left painting was done in Paris in the mid-1920s, when Szyk began to illustrate his first Hagaddah, which was never published. And though it was completed, the idea of printing it was abandoned for an unknown reason at the end of the 1920s. We return to this image shown earlier, but emphasize here Moses. Moses standing before Pharaoh in the bottom vignette. But there is a problem with this image. Surely Szyk knows that in the biblical narrative, it was not Moses who stood before the Egyptian ruler, but it was Aaron. And how do we know in the first place that it is Moses putting forth the rod standing next to Pharaoh and not Aaron? Because Aaron, the high priest, wears the breastplate of the 12 tribes and stands to the right. So why does Szyk paint Moses in this fashion, front and center before Pharaoh? The answer? To elevate the status of Moses to the Hagaddah reader. And here we see 3 Exodus images. The far right painting appearing in the Hagaddah, the center image painted in 1933, the image on the far left painted in the 1920s. This earliest image on the far left does not have Moses presiding over the Exodus, as in the later 2 images on the right, on the center and right, Moses at the top. Moses stands atop here in the upper right as the enemies of Israel perish. And this final slide of Moses. We return to this image once again, but focus here on Moses with a bare chest covered in part by a white beard. Here, Moses is shown as a bodybuilder, as if he had trained under the once popular fitness guru, Jack LaLanne. He's shown here as a military leader with his arms raised. The Israelites are victorious in battle. Szyk clearly has chosen, as we have seen throughout the Hagaddah, to emphasize that men and women must become involved in the physical redemption of their brothers and their sisters. And where the rabbis removed Moses from the Hagaddah and placed redemption totally in God's hands, Szyk chose to reinstate Moses in the Passover narrative. But rather than emphasize Moses as a religious leader, Szyk portrays him first and foremost as a military figure who is to be emulated by the Jews of Europe. This explanation is courtesy of my friend Rabbi Byron Sherwin. And now to David in the Hagaddah. Two images of the young David. And here, an elegant King David is shown here in the Hagaddah tailpiece. David, below David's are words recited as one completes the reading of one of the 5 books in the Torah scroll at the synagogue. Chazak, chazak, v'nit chazek, be strong, and may you be strengthened. Szyk chooses the words from Psalms 53:7 to inscribe on the tablet held by David. Oh, that the deliverance of Israel might come from Zion. When the Lord restores the fortune of his people, Jacob will rejoice, Israel will be glad. And what is wrong with this image? It should be the Egyptians in the chariot chasing the Israelites, but rather it is the Hebrews in the chariots running down their enemies. How so? Notice the Star of David on the chariot above the wheel, and the blue and white banner, both symbols of the Jewish people. The eagle of Rome or Nazi Germany hovers over the fallen enemy below the white steed on the left, while the dove of peace is associated with King David in the chariot, author of the psalm in Hebrew at the very bottom that accompanies this image. Ready the spear and javelin against my pursuers, and tell me I am your deliverance. Szyk again moves history in a way to emphasize the pride of victory for his people, driven by its heroic leaders. And now to Zionism motifs throughout the Hagaddah. The word Zion first appears on this page, and that is on the bottom left. An elderly man blesses his family as they head off as pioneers to the land of Israel. Zion, within the context, or within the center of the Star of David, and within the context of the Hebrew text of the Shehechianu prayer. Szyk encouraging Jews to leave Europe, that is in the mid-1930s, for new life in Zion in Palestine. Again, Zion inscribed within the Star of David. Matzah is the bread of affliction, and it's the bread of freedom. And in the bottom left, we see 2 Israelites in chains working for the Egyptian taskmasters, symbolizing affliction. But in the bottom right, 2 Jews are going off to the land of Israel as free men to be their own taskmasters, working for themselves. And to emphasize their character as the new Jew who will pioneer and secure the land, Szyk paints a tattoo, a Star of David, on the forearm of one of the 2 secular Jewish workers in the bottom right, who will carry off a macho spirit to the new land. In contrast here, a religious Jew sows the land. And to conclude the Zionism motifs, again, the blue and white banner, which were to become the colors of the flag of Israel. And now to the 4 sons. One final look at Szyk's 4 sons, which are painted twice in the Hagaddah, but with a focus this time at the parable that derives from them. Much like today, where there are different attitudes among American Jews toward the state of Israel. As the war ended in 1945, Szyk illustrated the different opinions toward the creation of a Jewish state through the parable of the four sons. Serving as the vice chairman of Peter Bergson's American League for a Free Palestine, Szyk strongly advocated for Jewish statehood. All of these American Jews have a distinctly different disposition. The wicked son asks in 1945, the wicked son, what is this nonsense about a Hebrew nation and an independent homeland? When all this fuss blows over, that is, when the war is well behind, let them, the survivors, return to their countries that they came from. The democracies will see to it that they are safe again and free to worship as other people are everywhere. The indifferent and uninformed sons need to be educated about the meaning of the land of Israel to the Jewish people, and that this land is precisely the haven European Jews require, despite the restrictions imposed by its British overlords. The wise son, a helmeted GI, asks, as a free citizen of the United States, sworn to support the principles of freedom and democracy through peace and in a succession of wars from 1776 to this very day, I want to know how I can help my fellow Jews of Europe and Palestine to survive and be free. How can I, the wise man asks, how can I help to stamp out this ceaseless persecution and banish for good the hideous specter of anti-Semitism? These questions and others were already at the forefront of Arthur Szyk's mind on the eve of the printing of his Hagaddah. And finally, to the dedication pages. We have fully explored this dedication page to the British King, except for one very important note. Szyk had added 3 additional words to the dedication, and those 3 additional words were unaddressed and unavenged, words which were removed prior to the Haggadah's printing. Szyk again self-censoring himself by painting over them with the 3 horizontal decorative bars below the text. Whether Szyk was under pressure from his editor or the publisher, we will never know. But these words initially appeared at the end of his dedication, which would have originally read, "At the feet of your most gracious majesty, I humbly lay these works of my hands, shewing forth the afflictions of my people Israel, unaddressed and unavenged." The dedication page to the Jews of Germany and Austria was created by Szyk after the Anschluss and the annexation of Austria and Kristallnacht both in 1938. The Hebrew text reads, "This Haggadah is presented to our brothers, the Jewish people of Germany and Austria, who were persecuted because of their race and their faith, and who gave their lives for the sanctification of God's name." These words, like those of the dedication page to George VI, were Szyk's. And similarly, in the dedication page on the right to the Jews of Germany in September 1939, shortly after the war broke out that month, Szyk began, "To the memory of my brethren in Germany in the 57th century, I am dedicating these pictures." The 57th century refers to the Jewish calendar year of 5700, which began on September 14th, 1939, almost 1 year after Kristallnacht and 2 weeks after Germany invaded Poland. Both of these dedications were never included in the printed Haggadah. And Szyk created the following dedication as well. And like two of the previous three dedications, his self-portrait also appears here. The Polish and Yiddish texts read, wanting to pay, and I quote, wanting to pay tribute to my ancestral homeland, the residence of my forefathers, I dedicate with great devotion and affection this particular Hagaddah. And in honor of the notables of the city of Lemberg, who were stimulated by my work, I am calling this book the Lemberger Hagaddah, the German name for Lvov, now called Lviv. Szyk remained forever devoted to his country of his birth and the Jews, like Mr. Horowitz, who supported his work there. This dedication page did not appear in the 1940 printed vellum edition, with the exception of one known copy. And one last dedication page, this one appearing at the end of the Hagaddah. And with this text, Szyk concludes his Hagaddah in French, where he states, I am but a Jew, praying in art. If I have succeeded in any measure, if I have gained the power of reception among the elite of the world, then I owe it all to the teachings, the traditions, and the eternal virtues of my people, Israel. And signed in the light red medallion, the very faint light red medallion, Szyk signs his name, Image to Israel, Arthur Szyk, painter of Israel. In contrast to the beginning dedication to George VI, signed Illuminator of Poland. My final slide presents side by side the first page of Szyk's Hagaddah with the last page of his Hagaddah, his frontispiece alongside the French dedication page. And why? Because I wish to emphasize that very element which pervaded his Hagaddah from beginning to end, Szyk's great love for the Jewish people and its eternal physical and spiritual capital of Jerusalem. If we look at the frontispiece on the left, at the very top of this first leaf, at the first sentence of the Hagaddah, we see the Hebrew words of the psalmist, Im eshkachech Yerushalayim tishkach yemini. If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. And if we then look at the last leaf of his Hagaddah, and the very last sentence, again, Im eshkachech Yerushalayim tishkach yemini. If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Szyk, the artist, whose Hagaddah was the work of his life, could not live without his right hand. Szyk, the man, could not live without Jerusalem and the love of his people at the heart of his soul. And to illustrate this very last point just a bit further, I would like to conclude my presentation with a short story about a man in a long black coat, which references Szyk's soul, the way in which my very first lecture began about the great man. In February of 2009, I traveled to Israel to exhibit and showcase my then recently published limited Szyk Hagaddah at the Jerusalem International Book Fair. Essentially, I went to Israel to begin to introduce a new generation of Israelis to Szyk through his Hagaddah. And while I was there at this crowded book fair, a man in a long black coat with the blackest black hat and the fullest black beard walked up to the glass showcase in the front of my booth, which was featuring Szyk's Hagaddah, and he said to me In perfect English, this is the Hagaddah of Arthur Szyk, correct? And as I learned later, he was from an anti-Zionist Hasidic sect, Toldos Aharon. I was not only astonished that he spoke to me, and that he spoke to me without a Yiddish accent, but that he recognized the Hagaddah. And then he stepped closer and he asked me, "May I tell you something?" And I said, "Yes, of course," I replied. And he said, "I know that Arthur Szyk was not a religious man," but he paused. And then he said, "Every time I look at the Hebrew calligraphy in his Hagaddah, I know that he was a man with a deep Jewish soul." It was worth my trip to Jerusalem just to hear this one line from one such anonymous religious man, and to know that Szyk's essence, that his heart and his soul, his hand and his heart, have the power to not only touch one man so very different from him, but to touch so many different kinds of souls through the ages. Thank you.
Thank you for this fascinating presentation, Irvin, and for improvising so quickly under the circumstances with a scratchy voice. The talk because we had to do a recording of your previous talk went a little longer than we had planned, but we will try to get in as many questions as we can. Again, if you have a question, please type it into the chat and Zola will share that with Mr. Ungar. And if there's time after that, we will open it up to live questions. So, Zola?
Sure. So it looks like we have the first question from a few minutes ago from Nancy. And Nancy's put in the chat, what reaction was there within the Jewish community to the dedication to the King of England? And if anyone wants to elaborate on their question also, all participants should be able to unmute themselves now.
Sure, it's okay. Thank you for, in 40 years, I've never asked myself to stand in for myself on any kind of talk. And I've never been sick, so I'm not taking this too well. But I appreciate the idea that you didn't hear me give a talk live, but in a sense, I'm alive and well. I hope to be even more so. But yeah, with regard, what was the reaction to the dedication page to King George VI? The answer is that the librarian for King George actually wrote a letter to the Beaconsfield Press and to Arthur Szyk after receiving the first copy of the Hagaddah in 1940. And he basically said that, this librarian said that for a fortnight, for 2 weeks, the king kept this book prominently located in Windsor Castle, and that he would show it to everyone who came into Windsor Castle. But whether the king understood what Szyk had done in that Hagaddah dedication page, it wasn't stated. So that's all I know of the king's reaction to that. You also have to remember this Hagaddah didn't come out until 1940. And it would not have been widely distributed, right? Because they printed only 250 copies of the book. And by the way, they're printing this book as the Battle of Britain's taking place. So bombs are falling all over London, and they're printing this Polish Jews book on this parchment, on this vellum. They couldn't even, I mean, can you imagine how they got the finest vellum parchment skins to print this book in wartime, and that it's going on? So the circulation of the book would not have been great. So a lot of people would not have saw it. For practical reasons, no, a lot of people wouldn't have. Szyk had hoped that when he went to London, that popular editions of this book would have been printed then, that everybody could have seen it. That was his objective. But the problem was that he could hardly even stay in England. He had to validate why he was there as an immigrant, because you had to show you were making money and that you could support others through your business also for economic reasons. And so a luxury deluxe edition was the best way to employ paper makers and bookbinders and everyone else. So they went with that, and he was disappointed, I'm quite sure. The popular edition wasn't published while he was alive and wasn't published until 5 years after he died, 1956 in Israel. So he had this fullest intention that everybody would see it, would know it. But from a practical point of view, they didn't.
Can I interject and just ask you to address when the popular editions became so ubiquitous? Because I've heard so many stories from congregants who had this, or seeing it from Carol, our congregant Carol, that when her uncle died on Yom Kippur, her father gave her the Szyk Hagaddah that he was awarded for his work with the Jewish community, which she has
Right. Was done a lot. Was done a lot.
was
These Hagadahs with different covers. I had blue velvet covers. Some had metal covers, not silver plate, just metal. 10,000 copies were printed in 1956. 10,000, which is an extraordinary amount of books to be printed in 1 year. And I was in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv in 56. Again, 10,000 more in 56, 57. I know this because I had all the printing records from Szyk's daughter where the family had received royalties. So I examined it and looked at them and counted it. But then they continued reprinting it through the 50s, 60s, 70s, up until the early 2000s. And they were widely circulated. I've met people who said that, well, it was in almost every Jewish home in Israel. Well, it wasn't, but it was widely circulated. And out there. And people ask about time, well, what's it worth? Does it have great value? Well, it has only value, sentimental value, really, to one's family. Unless you had the 1940 edition that has this beautiful leather binding and printed on parchment, not paper. Then you have a $40,000 book. But no, I get calls all the time. Oh, I found my grandfather's Hagaddah, or this guy came to him for my bat mitzvah. Well, what's it worth? You can spread the word that it's worth what it's worth to you. It's precious, unlimited in terms of what its value is, right?
But I'll just add that this one that anyone can
That's $20. That one you can buy for $20 on Amazon. If you buy it from me through my website. By the way, if you want to know more about Szyk, you can certainly go to my website of Szyk, SZYK.com. You can read a lot about him. Go to Wikipedia. The Wikipedia article about Arthur Szyk is very, very good. Also, I would tell you, you can buy from me or you can buy from Amazon. If you buy from Amazon, I make $1 a piece on these, so I'm advocating that. My 2017 book of Arthur Szyk, Soldier and Art, won the National Jewish Book Award that year, and it still can be purchased. It's an overview and one of the best books to dive in on an overview of Szyk. And thank you, Shelley, for mentioning at the beginning that my memoir on my life with Arthur Szyk, which is entitled, and that's traveling through life with a dead person for the past 30 years as my companion, who I fell in love with, as you can guess, is going to be published in early to 2026, after we're in the final stages of all the last minute editing. It's going to be published by the University of Texas Press at Austin. I couldn't be more happier, but that's my entire sort of life and everything that I've done to try to make a once famous and forgotten artist famous once again. And it's happening. There's so much going on with Szyk in the world. It's very gratifying. Anyhow, those are other resources you can go to, whether it's a website. I did give 4 lectures, as Shelley also mentioned, for the Museum of Jewish Heritage, and the other 3 are online as well. But one is about him, the great man, and the other is focusing just on his World War II art.
Which was very prevalent all across the United States in newspapers and
yeah. Oh, by the way, I think you're far from it, but if you're in New York, anytime starting in this September, and for a period of 9 months. There will be a major Arthur Szyk exhibition that is opening of original art. And you haven't seen Szyk's art, you've seen in the originals, but it's opening at the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York, that Lower Manhattan at Battery Park. It faces the Statue of Liberty. If you've never been, it's a great exhibit. Anyhow, it's going to be my current collection of original Szyk art. I'm not telling you that because it's mine. I'm only telling you that, well, I guess I'm telling you because it's mine, but that's not the point. Point is that you can see original art if you're in New York anytime over the next, between September and 9 months following its opening.
Great. Okay. Rena has a question. Zola's going to share that.
Thanks for sharing all those further resources, and to everyone in the chat who's shared some of their personal connections. It looks like Rena has also put a question about the end of the presentation. She's asked, is there significance to the way Szyk is holding his 3 fingers in both his self-portrait and the photograph?
Yes. Yes. Raise your hand. Who asked that question? That's wonderful. It's a fabulous question, because it is, for me, he is photographed in so many pictures with non-Jews. And I've seen him in, I think, at least 3 pictures with prominent men that are sitting around. I think those 3 fingers are over his heart. They are over his heart. And I think the 3 fingers like this also spell the word, the letter shin for Szyk. But also, I think that it's if I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. The idea of Jerusalem being a Jew among so many Poles or so many non-Jews, I think was a secret code of his in some kind. That's my take. Having seen so many pictures of Szyk and having understood why he's doing it, because you see it more than once. And it's in the Hagaddah like that too. It's in a self-portrait he did and in photographs people took. So
wow. Okay.
Great question.
So we have just a few minutes. Zola is going to unmute everyone. Please keep yourself muted until or unless you're called on. If you have a question or comment, please make it concise. Zola needs to leave in about 2 minutes, but the rest of us can stay on briefly. Sure.
I'll chat and schmooze with you after if you want.
Thank you.
Go ahead. Next. Who's asking a question?
Okay, I have a question. So who were artistically, first of all, illumination is a very interesting style of art. And I'm assuming it means you're illuminating words. It has to be a combination of text and art together, correct?
Beautiful. Well said.
And where does that all come from? And who are people that inspired other artists that inspired his style?
That's an excellent question. Yes, he was illuminating the text through illustrations, but illumination, because the style he worked in was a 16th century, 17th century, 16th century earlier technique, which he gravitated towards in the 1920s in Paris, where no one was doing illumination because it was already anachronistic by 400 years. But for him, it was the best way of telling a story through his art, because you're illuminating text. And he wanted his art to be absolutely clear what he was doing. He wasn't doing abstract art, which he abhorred. He used to say, art is not my aim, it's my means. And illumination allowed him to illuminate text and to give meaning more to art. He did a lot of pen and ink caricatures and cartoons, which you'll see in his art. Who influenced him? When he was a teenager in Paris, and he went there in 1910, sorry, to 1914. He went to the Academy Julienne, which had Diego Rivera was there, Jacques Lipschitz, others. And in a 3.5-year period while he was at school there, we have records that shows that in 3.5 years, he went to 14 classes. The Louvre, the Bibliothèque Nationale, the Cluny, the Wawel Castle in Krakow. These are places were his classroom. He had a couple of teachers. I can name a few, Aksentovich in Warsaw, where he took a class, Krakow, Warsaw, I just remember, for a few months. There were a few other people whose art he was known, but he knew the Polish nationalist painters. He knew those who were doing nationalist folk art. He knew and he integrated and synthesized all of them, but not one person. There was one person who had the strongest influence on who Arthur Szyk became, but wasn't an artist, and this was Zev Jabotinsky, the founder of Zionist, revisionist Zionist movement in Israel, as a person who should be strong as a Jew. So I'm not answering your question directly, but I am trying to give you a context for all of it. Thanks for your question.
Thanks very much for all these wonderful questions. Your website, www.szyk.com, is now posted online for those who want to do a deeper dive or find out more about these. This was just one slice of the incredibly prolific art of Arthur Szyk. It's very kind of Mr. Ungar to agree to stay a little bit after our talk and schmooze with us. So this concludes the formal portion of today's program. If you'd like to stay on a little longer, we will have a little bit of a extra few minutes to chat. Not much longer, but you're free to leave now. I thank all of you for coming. I profoundly thank Mr. Unger before Passover, especially, and during really tumultuous times. This is a profound and relevant mission that you're on to revitalize the work of Arthur Szyk, and we're all very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, Shelley, for all you went through in order to make the, you all don't know what Shelley goes through to make these programs happen. I mean, this woman, it's emails and follow-up and coordination stuff, but she really felt it. And she really wanted you to really get the most out. She really cares about the people she's serving. She wants to do meaningful things. And so she talked to me to China to get this absolutely right, but all with good intent and to make it happen. So I think maybe it could serve as an inspiration in a way to want you to learn more about him. And I like to ask my people who listen to me give talks, since I feel like I've give something, I would like you to do a favor for me, which that is to tell 2 or 3 people who've never heard about Arthur Szyk who he is. That would be great in spreading the word, and that'd be helpful. So anyhow, thank you, Shelley. And if anybody has any other questions you want to ask me, personal or otherwise, you're welcome to.
Oh, I just have one comment, though. Mr. Unger did not suggest that I ask anyone to buy the book, but because I bought this and got so interested in the Hagaddah, there is so much to learn and look at and study in this Hagaddah that's fascinating. And I don't think I appreciated when I saw this as a younger child, because the style of art at that time seemed old-fashioned to me, and I was exposed to more modern art. But there, in addition to the books that Mr. Unger has authored, there is a lot of text in here explaining in more depth if you want to get this for your
I'm
Passover.
putting you on the Today Show.
There we go.
Yeah, Carol, you have a question?
Is there any possibility that you can have your original art presented in a show in the Southern California region, like at the Skirball Museum?
Yes.
What has to happen?
Well, we're working on it.
Oh, cool. Wonderful.
If I find out about any such exhibitions, I'll let people at Mishkon Tequila
No,
know.
if you send me, if anybody here wants to be on my mailing list and be kept up to date about Szyk activities, you can, if you go to my website, szyk.com, and go to the contact page and just send me your email, I'll put it on, or you could just send me an email directly. My last name, which is Ungar, at my business name, Historicana, which is historic with an ANA on the end.com. Well, I'll put you on our mailing list. We send about once every month or 2 months something about what's happening with Szyk, or I write an article and stuff like that. So you could join that. And we're small. We don't give our mailing list contact info to anybody. And then you'll know what exhibits. I'm going to Israel in a couple of weeks because there's an exhibit of Szyk opening at the Menachem Begin Center in Jerusalem. So I'm giving a talk for that. But you know who put that together? Not Jews. Poles in Poland. I have friends in Poland who are Poles who are creating exhibits of Szyk's art and publications and stuff. And so they arranged for this, and the Polish Ministry of Education and Culture approached Jews in Israel to travel and exhibit about Arthur Szyk. How's that? It's pretty good. Do you know he was the director of art propaganda for Poland in its war against the Soviet Union in 1919, 1920? A Jew, the head of Polish propaganda, right? He was very well respected in Poland. He didn't like its anti-Semitism for sure, but he had close relationships with many of the higher ups, many of its presidents, many of its leading generals, many of its ambassadors. He knew them all. They all knew him. This was a very, very, what you don't necessarily get from this is that he was very, very, very famous when he was live. And I'm not talking just about in one country. He was very famous in Poland. I mean, I have all the newspapers, magazines, and stuff. When I started writing about him, there were no books about Szyk, so you couldn't read any of this stuff. I had to create this whole body of literature and stuff. But he was very famous in Paris in the 1920s when he settled there. Woody Allen missed the boat in Midnight in Paris, where he didn't have Szyk at the center of knowing everybody, because everybody knew him. And he's very famous in England. And when he came to America, wow, he became the leading anti-Nazi artist in America during World War II. His art was everywhere. Norman Rockwell illustrated covers of the Saturday Evening Post, right? Well, Szyk illustrated the covers of Collier's, and they had the same circulation, 2.5 million and 3 million. Everybody saw Szyk, but more people saw Szyk than saw Rockwell. I mean, it's very famous.
Can you
So
speak?
it's a shame he should be forgotten. So, but no more.
Can you speak just very briefly about your comments that the Nazis had a price, Hitler had a price on his head, and the circumstances of how he was able to flee?
Yeah, well, he left. When he came to Canada and then America in 1940, articles carried newspapers, or newspapers carried articles. I got my world, I'm a little bit backwards here. There were articles that said that Hitler had a personal price tag on his head. We couldn't find any. When I had an exhibit in Berlin in 2008, which is a whole other story. How do you have an exhibit of the leading anti-Nazi artist during World War II in Berlin? And I have a friend in Japan who wrote a book in Japanese about Szyk too. But how does all this stuff? I don't know where I was going somewhere with this. I forgot where I was going.
Just talking about the Nazi persecution of Szyk, or
yeah, hit a price on his head. When we had an exhibit in Germany, we did research on that. We couldn't find anything in the official German press or papers that they did, but it meant that he was the fact that newspapers would write articles like that meant that he was very, very well known, and his art was very powerful.
And obviously chose not to go back. Of course, felt it was
too. He's not going to go back. He didn't go back to when he came to America in 1940. He lived 11 more years. He died very early. He got a heart attack at the end of his life. He was 57 years old, and because he was investigated by the House on Un-American Activities of McCarthy and company, he got a light, and he had devoted himself to America. He had illustrated the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, Four Freedoms. Then he was investigated, got a heart attack, and died.
Oh, wow.
Rena has a question. Rena, unmute yourself.
Yeah. I just wanted to know, I remember we had another book aside from the Hagaddah that had
Anderson's Fairy Tales.
Pardon me? No, it was caricatures of Hitler. And I just wondered, I don't see those anymore anywhere. Do you have pictures of those or slides?
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, there's lots of slides and lots of pictures. I would say go to the museum, go to YouTube, or go to my website, and you'll be able to find the lecture I gave just on World War II, and you'll see tons of stuff.
Yeah, we had a book that had all those kind of pictures, and I don't know,
Yeah, The New Order, or
that's the one.
Had yellow, bright yellow dust.
Yellow.
Yeah, that's it then.
Okay, the Fisherman Phil crowd there has a question. Please unmute yourself.
All right, I'm going to stay with you for 5 more minutes, okay?
This was such a brilliant presentation, and I was particularly intrigued in thinking of the larger picture of Hagaddah and illustrated Hagaddah. And I know there must be a lot of information out there. Like, when was the first Hagaddah actually illustrated rather than just written?
There's going back to the 1300s. We certainly have the Bird's Head Hagaddah,
Oh, I've heard of that.
We've got, Ashkenazi Haggadot. We've got tons of them, but 1300s was really a time that probably, I mean, there's something earlier, but page or leaf exists. But it was early on. I mean, it's 700 years ago, 800 years ago.
I love the fact that he referenced a much more ancient style of art with the illustrations that he did, and yet the themes are so rapidly contemporary.
Right. That's why Szyk's here to stay, because
Yes.
his was made to be. And he used to. I knew he knew that when he used to. He used to say, "I created my art for permanence."
Mm.
So maybe this would be a good closing. I want to thank everyone for joining today and for your patience and flexibility as we improvised and did not exactly the talk that was planned, but a deeper dive into the Hagaddah. If you
Zena, thanks for your hearts.
And really appreciate Mr. Ungar pushing through this, even though you've been ill this week, and coming up with a really creative solution. As Passover approaches soon, I know at Mishkon Tefillah that our rabbi is doing a special program on Passover preparation, and we can begin to get prepared for Passover and many other Mishkan events that are upcoming. We're going to end this session now, and thank you all very much for coming. Mr. Unger, this has really been a fascinating talk, and really just an introduction into the art of Arthur Szyk. And for more about his political resistance, the Unger website that's posted online. And if you Google it, there's just tons of stuff. So thank you for bringing this, Mr. Unger, into prominence again, and for your mission all these decades of re-exposing us to this prolific and important artist, Arthur Szyk. And everyone stay healthy, as they say in Yiddish. Sei gesund.
Sei gesund.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Oh, and let's remember this.
Very good. Szyk. Bye. Shaddai.